Privet Katila Wandingriski desu, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of November 13th through 19th of 2023. And this week we have a lot of updates. Clashes are going on along the entire front, and this is one of the most active weeks I think I have seen thus far since the Battle of Bakhmut and the war and the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So this has been a very active week. So let's begin now. The main focus of this entire active week is in Avdiivka. Now, I've mentioned last week about Avdiivka. I've talked about, what the purpose of the operation is and so forth. But this week, the Russians have significantly advanced. I'm going to talk about the changes on the ground in Avdiivka. So we're going to first start in the north. Let's talk about Stepova, because that's what we talked about last week. So the Russians are still along kind of the eastern outskirts of Stepova. They've kind of reached up to kind of like around this line. They also probably have control over this tree line, and so they've kind of did an effect. They have a little bit of a securing on the eastern flank of Stepova. However, they are not in control of all of Stepova. Now, you might be wondering, well, what's happening? Are the Ukrainians still there? Well, no. The Ukrainians are back in Berechi. They're still in this village. So the AFU has been expelled from Stepova, so they're not in here. They are doing attacks, but the Russians themselves cannot also try to secure themselves along these positions, because this is a very concentrated area, and Ukrainians could just bomb this area into oblivion. So, it's very hard to just, because, if they secure this position, they're basically going to be maybe along this tree line and along this tiny tree line, and the Ukrainians will just bomb this incessantly, very hard, and it's going to be very hard to hold this without massive losses of manpower. So basically, the Russians could only secure kind of the western outskirts of it, or the eastern outskirts, sorry, and, kind of in this area, and then the rest is in a gray zone. So the Ukrainians sometimes go in here to attack, and sometimes the Russians counterattack, but this area is fortified and controlled by nobody, the center of the village and the western part of it. So the Ukrainians are still in Berechi, for control here. The Russians are in the on the eastern part of Stepova, but the middle of Stepova is in a gray zone. So that's what's happening in this village. However, where the Russians have instead advanced is to the northwest and to the north. So to the northwest, they have moved along the dacha. They captured this dacha of Krasnogorivka last week. They also advanced. They are now advancing north to getting very close to the dacha of Orchechny. Now, Orchechny is the main Ukrainian supply depot for this Avdiivka front. This is where, so they have a rail line here. So this goes to the major Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk, which is where kind of like a main headquarters. And then they send supplies and troops from that area to this. They get disembarked in Orchechny, and then they go off to secure in the north, and they go off to secure themselves here. And that's why most of the battles have been taking part in the north. So this is a major Ukrainian supply base, and the Russians are getting very close to it. And the Russians were able to do this because there are two rail lines here. One that goes to Avdiivka, and another that goes away from it. But this basically creates conditions to allow the Russians to defend themselves in the north and into the west as well. So they're just advancing up. Some sources say that they are basically are trying to reach this tree line right now. And once this tree line's taken, basically then the dacha of Orchechny would be wide open. And basically the Russians are just advancing more north, and they've captured more tree lines. They've also advanced to the north as well. So they're advancing this way and are right now trying to capture this area right here, this tree line. They are also advancing north. They captured this tree line and are now a lot of sources are saying, mostly Russian sources though, so you could say maybe they're over-exaggerating, but they say they're now on the outskirts of Novokalinova. So the Ukrainians are probably, they're in this area. You could see, in these areas. But, so these tree lines in the fields between the rail line and the village itself are probably now being contested or under Russian control. Now, one thing that's actually changed also is map thing. So, as you can see here, there's been a Google map change. So the map I'm using uses, I think, Google Maps, and Google Maps, updates every few months, every year or so, and you could actually see the changes on the ground happening. So if you want to, for example, let's say, what's a good example? Well, I guess I'll show you when I get to it, because, but basically you can now kind of see the extent of the trench networks. We'll talk about this in Bakhmut, but you could see, like, because before, you see the map as it is before the war started, or before that was. So you might say, well, there's no, I don't see any trench lines except the pre-war ones. Like, for example, we go to the south of Avdiivka, in this area, you could see the trench lines here, for example, because these were built years ago and have been developed since then. So this is a very, developed trench network. So that's you can see the pre-war ones, but you don't really see the war ones as much. So, and they've updated, so now you could see a lot of it. I think since early this year, I believe. Anyway, so they continue advancing along the rail lines towards Novokulinova, towards Orcheshny, and they made Stepov into a gray zone. It's going to be a hard, obviously the Russians are trying to close Avdiivka, but obviously they cannot continue. I think what they might try to do is advance here and probably try to take Berdichi from the south. So they might try to take this dacha, take this tree line, and probably advance somewhere here and outflank Berdichi instead of attacking straight forward, if that makes sense. So that might be what the Russians are trying to do. The advances here, this is where the Ukrainians are trying to press the Russians to stop them from advancing to the west. So if they could take these areas, would also allow them to advance towards Orcheshny, and also stop any, because after this, it's going to be really hard for the Ukrainians to secure themselves more in the north. They'll have to, get pushed back. So this would finally secure Krasnohorivka from the north. I don't know if the Russians don't necessarily need to take these two villages, Karamik and Novokulinova, but these are two areas where the Ukrainians are stationed to continue trying to press the Russians from the north. So if they take these, not only will it basically secure the main Russian position in Krasnohorivka, which is where is a step-off point to continue their encirclement of Avdiivka from the north, it would also allow them to begin pressure on the main Ukrainian logistic of Orcheshny. And so there's a lot of movement along the flanks here in the north, but also there's also some advancements in the south from the north, if that makes sense. So from the Terrakon, as they call it, this is the main waist heap, the main dominant height in this area, the Russians are advancing to the south. They managed to advance south and capture this filtration system. This is a little small industrial point. So this was captured, and basically this entire area along the rail line has also been captured. If we look at Rybar's map, if we look at this is the map they show it here, the pumping station. So as you can see, they are the Russians are advancing down south towards the Avdiivka dachas. So along this area. So now clashes are going on for the dachas here, and they are also advancing south here. So they also managed to increase the buffer around the village of Vasola, and they are now probably along this tree line and probably capture this as well. I don't really see why this is not colored in. Because there's nothing to defend here. So I'm pretty certain that since the Russians are now advancing, trying to take these dachas here, and basically take these this forest line here. What's the purpose of this? Well, not only does it level the front line a little bit, it also helps them advance on the coke plant. Now, this is one of the major industrial hubs of Avdiivka. This is one of the main fortified areas. This is the main fortified area, and then the second main fortified area is these high-rise buildings right here. Now, the other one is also the pre-2014 defense line, but this one I'm going to talk about in a sec is actually falling, and Ukraine will probably lose this defense network very soon. So, this coke plant is one of the main strong points for Ukraine, and taking these dachas in this forest area here is essential to, so it's not like they can only attack the coke plant from one area. They could storm it from in multiple areas. They could cut it off. In fact, they could try to cut it off, from the south here. So they might advance to here and then start battles here, and then cut the coke plant from the rest of Avdiivka. So that they're advancing south, and they actually started this at the end of this week. So we'll have to see how much progress Russia will do on these dachas. Now we're going to go to the south of Avdiivka. So the Russians have stopped trying to push from this area towards Serena because of the heavy minefields in this area. So the Russians are kind of not trying to advance the pincers up towards Serena and Tonika. However, they are advanced. The major advances in the south of Avdiivka are happening in the pre-war front lines. Now, a lot of people thought this would be, that there wouldn't be any attacks here because of, the whole point of encirclement was so they could bypass these pre-2014 defense networks. However, the Russians made an advance and actually made significant progress, and that actually was really surprising. The main areas of attack have been in this industrial point, which was one of the main key hubs of the pre-war Ukrainian defenses in Avdiivka. Now, a lot of sources are saying basically they've advanced up to the 2014 Avdiivka Memorial. I think this is it right here. It's somewhere along this street. I forgot where, but basically this is now where the front line is. They basically reached this memorial, and basically they say about 80 to 90% of the industrial plants have been captured. And now the Russians are advancing to try to take these dachas right here. So once they take these dachas, which are also heavily fortified, if you look here, you could see the trench lines here. So this is not going to be a walk in the park, but they need to capture this in order to secure this one of the key nodes of the 2014 defense network. Probably what they're going to try to do from here is that once this is captured, they'll start advancing north. They'll probably advance along the street that they used to take this industrial point and try to enter the residential area of Avdiivka here. These are not heavily fortified. They still have places of defense, but they're going to be easier to take. And then once they probably reach this cemetery, they're going to try to basically cut off another main point of Ukrainian defense, which is this filtration system in this forest area. This is what's keeping the Russians at bay near Kurabalka here. But they were trying to collapse this and force the Ukrainians to retreat. Probably the same thing with advances here, because then, all the Ukrainian defenses that are in this area, this open field, will be compromised. There's lots of trenches here because this is still kind of part of the a little bit of the 2014 network, but the Ukrainians have a lot of positions in these open areas, which is hard to advance because these are open fields. So the Russians have to basically force them to withdraw because it's going to be hard to attack them. It's flat, but it's also that's a plus for the defenders as well. So the Russians probably from advancements here are trying to squeeze out the Ukrainians here and push them back to the main Avdiivka city itself. However, there's also been clashes for the Torska Hota, this hotel. This is one of the other main nodes of Ukrainian defenses in the 2014 network. This is the only, I think, strong, like a constructed site that is on a height here. So they oversee the area here, and everything else is forest. So once the Russians take this hotel, they say they advanced up to it. So we'll have to see if they capture it, then basically this is another area where they could begin to enter the residential areas. Because once this is captured and once they fully secure this industrial point, which they probably can by the end of next week, it just depends if the progress continues. Maybe the Ukrainians see the dire situation and slow down the Russians, but once it does happen, and it will, the Russians basically have an open node into the residential area, and this basically will be swept up pretty easily. Not like instantly, but it won't take as long, and they'll just advance further north. And while this is happening, this was basically the main Ukrainian defense point. So if these things fall, this is way open for them. And then basically the only thing the Russians have to really notice is this main defense node of the high-rise buildings. This is going to probably be what's going to take so long to take. And I actually think the coke plant might actually fall faster than this area. This will probably be like another Bakhmut, where you know, Avdiivka will be mostly fallen by probably January, but we'll probably see, you know, Ukrainians be in this area. So maybe 80% of Avdiivka will fall, but parts of it, the most fortified area, is going to be still under Ukrainian control. So most of the town will fall, but the Ukrainians are still going to be in these areas. So uh, lots of progress in Avdiivka, lots of things to talk about there. Advances in the north and advances in the south. Um, Mostly, though, to in a different direction that we're used to. Usually, we've tried to see them advance towards to encircle it, but this might be like another Bakhmut where they're just trying to encircle it enough to put this road under fire control and basically um, put the squeeze on it and then advance into it. So we'll have to see if the advances continue. So lots of advances in Avdiivka. Now we're also going to now in tandem with this, actually, the Ukrainians tried to launch another offensive into Gorlivka here. They actually managed to capture this a part of the Russian 2014 defense network in this waste heap here as well. The Russians still hold a lot of the other waste heaps. They kind of made their defense lines in Gorlivka along these waste heaps before they could enter the city itself. But the Ukrainians made this attack because they want to draw Russian reserves here. Because the Russians are attacking in Avdiivka. They are advancing in Bakhmut, which we'll talk about in a second. And so, the Ukrainians are like, hey, why don't we try to advance here and distract the Russians and slow them down here? I don't think the Ukrainians are trying to take this city. Like, I think that's delusional. This is like as big as Donetsk almost. It has hundreds of thousands of people. I think this is almost as big as, well, maybe not as big, but probably almost as big as Mariupol. This is a huge city. It is on the 2014 defense line. This is really hard to take. So I think this is more of a distraction operation to slow down the Russians in Bakhmut and Avdiivka. But, again, it's kind of surprising that the Ukrainians actually managed to take a part of the 2014 defense nodes. But this is something to look at to see if the Russians manage to capture this back or the Ukrainians continue attacking and expanding their foothold here. So we'll have to watch it in the coming weeks. Now we're going to talk about the next big place of operations in Bakhmut. The Russians, when they've been on the defensive here, and the Russians are now on the offensive here. Since summer, they've been on the defensive, but now they're on the attack. We're going to talk about the north because this is where a lot of the major attacks are happening as well. The Ukrainians have been fully pushed back to their pre-offensive line. So after Bakhmut fell, the Ukrainians were held up in Kronova, they were held up in Bogdanovka, and and after that, when Wagner withdrew, the Ukrainians were given the order to advance in the south and in the north. And so in the north, they managed to advance up to the outskirts of Berfiki and Yadidna, and actually, started clashes for these two villages, but they were defeated, and they were fully pushed back, and now the Ukrainians are back in their pre-offensive front lines before they attacked in the summer. So, and not only that, the Russians are now bombarding Kronova, and they are bombarding Bogdanovka. And so, right now a lot of sources are also saying they've advanced to try to take this area right here. They are also trying to advance in this tree line. And so basically they are trying to get into the outskirts of Bogdanovka and get Kromova and take these two villages. Or at the very least suppress Ukrainians here, because we don't know exactly what Russians are planning in Bakhmut. Are they just trying to get back straighten the front line out, and basically return what they lost in the summer, or are they trying to actually begin their advances into Chasiv Yar, or maybe, as I predicted, this is part of a bigger offensive to start going northwest to cut off Seversk. And this, they need to flatten this front line and advance here in order to begin that. We don't know. I think this is a more limited operation. I think, the Russians are just trying to push the Ukrainians back to Chasiv Yar and stop the encirclement of Bakhmut. So basically, the Ukrainian Bakhmut offensive has been a failure as well. Now I might be wondering, okay, in the north they never really advanced that much anyway. It doesn't really matter. They got pushed back here, but in the south is where they made most of their advances, and that's true. They still hold on to those advances in the south. However, the Russians are now on the offensive here as well. They managed to retake all positions along the rail line that they. So this was the main new Russian defense line, and the Ukrainians over the last month and a half have been trying to break through this new defense line after the Russian defenses in Klishevka and Andriivka fell. However, they got pushed back. However, once those fell, they made a new front line, and now the Ukrainians are attacking here. And they took some positions. They managed to enter some positions. However, they got fully retaken, and so now the Russians are fully secure in their defense. However, the Russians are not stopping. They are trying to take these two villages. They're advancing along this forest line and are trying to enter take what they call which is the main fortification. In this area of Klishevka right here, these are the dominant heights. Klishevka itself is on the low ground along with this area, and so taking these heights are essential for defense. Now, so the Russians are, a lot of sources are saying the Russians are in like the northern outskirts of Klishevka, and that they are, and then so they're advancing along this forest line, advancing along this area, so they're trying to retake Klishevka. Now, this is where the map thing I was talking about. If you look here, this map has been updated. Look here. Do you see these trench lines here? Like this massive trench network. Here, along with, it goes up here. You can see the trench line here. The trench probably continues in here as well. You can see a lot of this is like one of the big trenches here. There's also, you can see a little bit here as well. You can see the trench lines here. So you can see a massive Ukraine, massive, you can see the trench lines here because these weren't built in 2014. They were built during the Battle of Bakhmut. And so, you might think, oh, well, Klishevka is such a small town. Why is it taking so long? Well, look, this is why. This is just one thing they caught, one part of the village. And so, that's why it's so hard to take. This is World War I still fighting. It's hard to take, a few meters. But however, the Russians are advancing. They also managed to. A lot of sources are saying they fully recaptured Andriivka, or at the very least, it's back in the gray zone. The Ukrainians they conquer this town or this village and actually tried to start advancing along outside the rail lines. However, the Russians made a counterattack, not only secure themselves along the rail line, they are now attacking Andriivka, retaking the village. However, the village itself is a complete is basically burned to the ground. There is nothing here left. If you saw the villages from earlier, the images of when the Russians withdrew from this town, it was completely flattened. So this doesn't really help the Russians, but taking this village back, is essential to give a breakthrough, to give a what's the right word? A pull-off point to what's the right word? Like where you break through here and like a foothold. Yeah, that's where you go. So you can continue advancing, and I think the Russians are trying to advance to get along the canal again. Basically, have it be along the canal here. So they'll try to retake Klishevka and get along this area, and then they'll probably try to advance north and get closer to Ivanivska, and finally probably try to take this town as well, to be honest. But they try to flatten the front line a bit, instead of it kind of, because the Ukrainians punctured into the flanks, making it a bit not as flattened. So they're trying to retake what the Ukrainians took to make it more flat. That's actually why Wagner did what they did, because they wanted to have a more flatter front line. And then once they took Bakhmut, that's all they had to do. So that's what's happening. So Bakhmut is another area that the Russians are attacking in. So lots of advances here. There's also been some advances, not advances, but restarting of activations in the Seversk front, mostly in the village of Spornia. A lot of sources are saying that are showing that lots of bombings in this area, and the Russians are now trying to attack and capture. You can actually see it here. This is another area where they've updated the map. This is Spornia. You might think, wow, it's just so small, but look how much. Look at all these shells that they, all these areas have been shelled heavily, and you could see, you could see, I think some like trench line. You could see like all these villages are burned to all these houses are burned to the ground. You could see it on the Russian area as well, I believe. Where is it? Yeah, here. Right, see, oh, look at this. Like, this is the industrial zone. It was completely burned to the ground. So this area is completely like burned to the ground, but it's still. So this is like where you can actually see some where the map is updated as well. So very heavy fighting. So the Russians are probably trying to retake this town. Might be wondering what's the purpose. Mostly to to make it more like straightened out. The Russians are just trying to advance and put the pressure on the Ukrainian grouping in Seversk. This is why they've been trying to take Biligorivka and Spornia, because these kind of puncture into the Russian lines, and they want to take these two villages to flatten it out. So there's that. So just a little bit, I think the Russians are, trying to advance. They're trying to take Spornia, but this has been going on for a while. So we'll see if they take it, but I just wanted to say that in an update that they've restarted operations in that area. Another thing we want to talk about is in the Kupinsk-Luhansk front, mostly in the northern edge of it, and mostly in this area in the Klishchiivka garrison here. So the Ukrainians have this defense node in Klishchiivka around the rail lines, Koltarovka, Ivanivka, and these areas formulate a main Ukrainian nexus point, a defense point, which, if taken, again, there's nothing after the Russians take this strong point, which is basically then they could advance to the southern edge of Kupinsk. The Russians are right now in the northern edge of Kupinsk, trying to take the Kupinsk suburbs of Sinkovka, Petropolovka. These areas are very heavily, are being fought over. But this week they are trying to take this so that they could kind of advance to the south and have north and south basically begin like a semicircle around Kupinsk and then begin pressuring on two sides. But they need to break through this garrison here first. And this week they basically advanced and put part of the village of Ivanivka back in the gray zone, or into the gray zone. They also managed to reach the outskirts of Klishchiivka. So this is a very heavily, this is a main defense point. So this is the main area. So they're trying to take Ivanivka, and then from there attack Stepo Novoselivka. And then once they get these two villages, they could then, advance and take the highway, and then basically cut off the main Ukrainian, try to basically surround and cut off the Ukrainians here and force them to withdraw. The Ukrainians are very, very heavily defended in Klishchiivka, but the Russians are trying to outflank them and advance here. They advanced, they took a few spots here, and so the main clashes are going over here. Before, it used to be trying to take Sinkovka, however the Russians have failed to take this village, so now they are focusing here to take this group of villages, because this is another, so the Ukrainians are defended along the Sinkovka-Petropolovka line here. That's one of their first defense points. Another defense point in this area. This is where the Russians are focusing. The Ukrainians are also, after they lost Novoselivka, they are basically, they pushed themselves back along the Zhir-Bets River, having that be their next point of defense. Here, the Russians also made it a bit complicated for the Ukrainians, where, they made an advance here, but the Ukrainians, the Ukrainians had to be pushed back from the Zhir-Bets River to kind of these row of villages, and the Ukrainians basically have these like forward observation places to prevent the Russians from advancing here. So they have along these villages. And then the next area of defense for the Ukrainians is along the Zhir-Bets River in Bavkivka, Nisivska, Terny, and basically that's where the rest of the Ukrainian defenses are. And then in the south they have the Kremenaya Forest, which is another area of defense. So the Ukrainians have like these nexus of defenses here, and the Russians are trying to have operations to try to break through on each section. But right now for this week, they're mostly focused on Klishchiivka. Made some advances, put Ivanivka in the gray zone, but we'll have to continue to follow. This place has actually been very slow for the Russians. I think this will also be where the Russians mainly will advance, in terms of like this is in the winter when the ground is hard again. They'll do a massive offensive, I think, here to break through and try to to advance along the Oskol River, take Liman, take Kupiansk, and that I think that's where they'll try to push, in my opinion. So I think these are mostly for tactical purposes. All right. So we talked about this area. We're going to talk about now the areas where the Ukrainians are on the attack. Now, the Ukrainians have started their Kherson offensive. They are still in the village of Krinky. However, the Ukrainians are basically now trying to secure themselves along the center of the village and also trying to break through to get some positions along the forest line. However, besides that, there hasn't actually been any changes on the Kherson front, but my guess is the Ukrainians are still, I just wanted to update that the Ukrainians are still in Krinky. The Ukrainians are putting more troops there, and I think the Ukrainians are going to try to maybe take the Kinburn Spit and such like that. So I think this is more of a distraction operation, and this is like the first part of their Kherson offensive. But they haven't actually expanded it after they took the center of the village since in about like a month ago. So the Ukrainians are still trying to create their bridgehead in Kherson. There's also been actually advances in the advances on the Zaporozhye front. The Ukrainians are trying to improve their positions on the salient. They are advancing in two places mostly. To the west of Robotina, they are trying to secure themselves along these tree lines here to basically improve their positions to the west of Robotina. And they are also they're trying to advance in the north of Verobova. They're trying to basically advance, take these tree lines and advance and break through here to cut, try to take Verobova from the north, because when they tried to attack Verobova from the south, that was a failure as well. So they're now trying to advance in the north and I guess what they're trying to do is put Verobova in two pincers. So that once this is taken, they could restart operations here and try to take Verobova from the south. Again, the purpose of all this is to improve their positions here. They're not trying to make some massive breakthrough to Tokmak. They are basically just trying to improve their positions a little bit to make the salient more feasible. The Russians are also on the offensive here. They actually managed to advance from Zhirbanka into Pitakaki here. So I think the geolocated footage showed the Russians in this area right here. And so I think this village is either in the gray zone or under light Ukrainian control. But the Russians are basically trying to advance and I think maybe secure this village again, just to make it redo any Ukrainian gains they gained in this section. So the Russians made a small tactical advance here, and the Ukrainians are managing small tactical advances on the Robotina front. But again, mostly these are to improve the tactical positions. It's more of an active defense on both sides here. For the Ukrainians, it's an active defense, but also like a little bit of an offensive just to improve the tactical positions, not necessarily to make a war-winning breakthrough, if that makes sense. There's also been advances in the Velika Novosolika line, the South Donetsk area, mostly in this area. So the Russians are now, as I mentioned, in previous weeks, they advanced from Prinutia, and they are now advancing towards the northeast, and they are now battling for the strategic heights around Staromayorska here, and to try to cut this main road that connects Staromayorska to Rivnopol here. And basically, once this is this road is cut, then they only have one road left. But it's already under complete Russian control. And while as this road, you could, when you enter Rivnopol and try to drive down here, you're not necessarily. It takes, once you reach here, you can be under attack by the Russians directly, but you might maybe try your luck. While it's here, you're going to be bombed really hard. So cutting this road and taking the heights is very important for the Russians. They are advancing here. They are taking more tree lines and such. And they also managed to advance, I think, towards the east of Orozhina as well. They I think are advancing here, and I think what they're trying to do here is recapture these two villages. Now remember, when we talked about like 2 or 3 months ago when the Ukrainians advanced here, once they took these two villages of Starmayorsko and Orozhaina, they are then tried to secure their flanks. They tried to take Kremenchuk. They tried to take Novodonetska. They tried to take Prunutia, because then they'll have a new front line. However, since they couldn't take Novodonetska or Prunutia, the flanks are still under Russian control, and this salient is still kind of bad for them. However, the Russians could have control of this. Then they basically did what the Ukrainians wanted, where they have this entire area as one singular front line, so it's better defended. The Russians don't need to take these villages, because again, the reason why the Russians withdrew from these areas more easily is because this was already a salient. If you remember, the Russians had control up to here. However, these areas were under complete Ukrainian control. So it was just a salient that didn't really need to be that deep. You could say that this put supplies to Velika Novosolka more under threat, but I think the Russians are fine with just taking these two villages. So I think the Russians are also trying to take, they're doing another offensive, small offensive here. It's not a main one like it is in Avdiivka and such, but they are advancing nonetheless because the Ukrainians pulled all their main offensive troops from this area to Kherson, which is why they are able to advance in Kherson, because they're using their elite marine units there. No major changes in Ugledar or Marnica. So yeah, that's the advances for this week. Lots of advances. The Russians are advancing in Avdiivka, in Bakhmut, and in Kupiansk, and while the Ukrainians, and along with near Velika Novosolka, while the Ukrainians are advancing or trying to advance in Kherson and maintain their bridgehead and improve their salient around the Zaporozhye front. So advances almost everywhere, lots of fighting, and probably next week we'll see fighting as well. Well, obviously, but we'll see what changes happen next week. So I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it around. Comment your thoughts, and subscribe to my channel to see more videos similar to this one. So aim high, wander on, from America with Russian love.